Hi everybody, it's Sue from slowideas.com. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about sewing machine needles and explain the different types and what you can use them for. Okay, so by now, hopefully you know that you should match your type of machine needle to the fabric you're sewing and the kind of sewing you're doing with it. But what does that actually mean? So I'm going to go through some of the most common sewing machine needles and what types of fabric you might use them on, and talk a little bit more about how I use sewing machine needles. I don't cover absolutely every type of sewing machine needle in this video because I'm just using the ones that I have in my collection and that I use most frequently as a garment sewer. So let's get going. Okay, the brands out there. The two most common brands of sewing machine needles are Class A and Schmetz. Both of them are available at most fabric stores around me. They're both available. There may also be other sewing machine needles out there called Organ. I know Janome makes some sewing machine needles, and there seems to be something called Prim, and maybe that's available in other countries, but I haven't really seen it a lot here in Canada. I happen to have one from God knows where. Maybe I got it at a garage sale or something like that. But Class A and Schmetz are sort of the most common and most frequently seen brands of sewing machine needles. So they come in different sizes, and there's two different types of sizing systems. There's American, which goes from 8 to 19, and there's European sizing that goes from 60 to 120, usually by tens, although I have seen a 65. The good thing to remember is that the smaller numbers are always the smaller needles. So if you're looking for something super duper fine for sewing very delicate fabric, you want to be going with a 60 perhaps, if you can find one. They're out there, and if you have a well-stocked fabric store, you can probably find them. All the way up to 110, 120, which is probably for a leather and for denim and stuff like that. Alrighty, so the most commonly used, and of course the name is universal sewing machine needles. They come in sizes ranging from 60 to about 100 I've seen, and they have a slightly rounded tip, but not like super duper rounded. And as we'll go through these videos, I've tried as much as possible to make my photos of these needles zoom in enough so you can see some of the differences. But if necessary, you can always pause and rewind this video and go back and compare. So the universal needle is just basically a fairly simple machine needle. It doesn't have anything too special about the eye of the needle or the scarf, which is the part on the back of the needle, which here is showing on the right hand side. That's the scarf, and that's the sort of slot down behind on the back side of the needle. So most sewing machine needles, on the top of them, it's hard to see here and I don't have a picture of it, but they have a flat side and a rounded side. Often on the rounded front you'll see the brand name and then a little bit of information about the size. Schmetz needles also has, nowadays they have color coding on their needles, so you can tell from looking at the color what type of needle you're holding. That can help because if you get your needles mixed up and start using the wrong one for the wrong kind of thing, you're going to be sad. It won't work. Okay, so what types of fabric do you want to use your universal needles for? Not everything, shockingly. So I've taken some photos here. We've got, this is wool tweed that I've been using for one of my dresses. It's a fairly relaxed, it's a dense weave, but it's not like super fine fibers. I can see the fibers with the naked eye, and I can see as they're coming off I can see these are nice wool natural fibers. You don't have to be using natural fibers to use a universal. There's lots of polyester fabric you can use. I also have another kind here called quilting cotton, not surprisingly used for quilting, although the universal needle, which is what I use for quilting, you can also get a quilting needle, which is a size 80, and it has a slightly longer and more tapered shaft to it to help you have more precision in your seams, because when you're sewing quilts, then precision matters a lot. So if you're not a fussy sewer, you can do your quilting with a universal needle. No biggie. Okay, so the sharp needle, also known as MICROTEX, that's Schmetz's brand name for it. There's a Schmetz box. I've shown a couple of Schmetz boxes. I have some Class A boxes as well. So MICROTEX are sharp needles. They have a longer, thinner shaft and a sharper end. They're not really rounded at all. That tip is pointier, and they are good for, where's my blue fabric here? I've got some polyester satin crepe here. This is lovely fine stuff. The fibers are let's see if I can get to the end. The cat is now walking all over the fabric. So the fibers themselves are very, very thin compared to that wool tweed that I was working with. And this is very densely woven fabric. So the sharp needle helps to get through that and minimizes the size of the holes in the fabric. So if you unpick your seams, which inevitably you will unpick your seams, you won't end up with needle holes. Sharps are also useful for things like this cat, not this cat, don't poke your cat with needles, bad idea. She's just walking across and wants to lie down on the keyboard. Great, thanks. Okay, so this is a Polartec nylon, and the face of it is actually woven nylon, and then it's bonded to this fleece on the back. And so it's not stretchy at all, really. It's quite firm, and that face is very densely woven, so when I sew this, I'm going to be using a sharp needle. Sharps also come in different sizes. However, I typically just use like a 70 or an 80. So, yeah. Okay, next up we have ballpoint needles. These are for sewing knits. You don't want to use a universal needle or a sharp on a knit because it does have that pointier tip to it, and it can catch on the threads or break the threads as it's going through the knit fabric. There's sort of the fibers are sort of overlaying and knotted around each other, because that's what knitting is, lots of knots. And when you poke through that, if you sort of pierce one or catch on one, then the needle can't get through, and what happens is it's not getting through with the appropriate timing to pick up the bobbin thread as it's going by, so it's not able to create loops, and you'll get what's called skipped stitches. So you'll have sewn a bit, and then it'll be like, hey, wait a minute, that didn't make any stitches, what gives? You've got skipped stitches, you're using the wrong kind of needle for your fabric. So I use a ballpoint needle where I'm doing sort of relaxed sort of fabric. Kitty, I have to move you because I need to get the fabric out. There. Here. So actually this merino knit was a good example of something that I used the ballpoint needle for, and also this is the one I've got a photograph of here. This is a rayon polyester knit. I can actually sort of see through I can see you. The knit fibers. It's a fairly loosely woven knit, even though it looks tight. So the ballpoint is great for that. Then if you have knits that have some elastic content in them, or they're very dense and tight, then you might want to use a stretch needle, which has a longer, more tapered and pointier end to it, or tip to it. It's great for things like this nylon polyester spandex knit, or my nemesis, which is clear sewing or clear bathing suit elastic, which is basically just like rubber. I can't even really see the knit. It might actually just be rubber. So, and honestly, I'm going to say your mileage may vary. You may try using a stretch needle on this stuff and it doesn't work. I'd say you got to experiment and figure out what works for you, because I'm not making any promises when it comes to this stuff. It's evil, but it's so useful at times. So frustrating. Okay, some other types of needles that are out there. Jeans needles, they are quite obviously going to be wider and tougher. They have a reinforced blade for punching through denim. They also create slightly larger holes than your typical universal needle. And they have a larger thread hole because often when you're working on jeans, you're going to use top stitching thread. That's that yellow thread that we see on our blue jeans. It's usually cotton. It is thicker than normal sewing thread, and so you need a slightly larger needle. If you're sewing jeans with a jeans needle, you want to lengthen your stitch length, because you don't want to have your stitches too close together, because that's many holes, and they're broader holes, so they can weaken the points where you're actually doing your seams. So there's some things about sewing jeans. Leather needles, you can see the difference here. I've actually switched them left and right, which one's the front and which one's the back. I apologize for that. But leather needles have a sort of a wedge tip, and that helps to dive through leather fibers. If you're sewing leather, get yourself a leather tip needle. Serger needles. So here's some of that Class A packaging. It's a little bit different from the Schmetz packaging. Smaller, holds the same number of needles, usually cheaper. So Serger needles actually have a shorter shaft to them, so you can't use them in your sewing machines. They have kind of like a universal tip, so they'll go through knits. They're slightly rounded bottom, but it will be really hard if you're trying to go through like swimwear, or especially trying to serge clear elastic. Oh my god, it's just such a pain in the ass. So don't try to put clear swimsuit elastic on your serger without stitching it down on your sewing machine first. I would say that. So that's some single needles, and then we get to some fun stuff, the twin needle family. So they come in twins or triplets, and they are multiple needles attached to one shaft. So I forgot to take a picture of these with my macro lens, but you can see the photo there, and then here's one here. There is a sort of a blue bar across the top, and then the needles are attached on the bottom. And they come usually in one needle per package, not 5 like for other types. And the sizing on them, they come in the same sizes from 60 to 120, although I've never seen a 120 stretch needle or twin needle ever. They do come in either stretch or universal, and they will come with different measurements between. So I've got a stretch needle here, stretch twin, that has 2.5 millimeters between the needles, and then I've got a universal that has 2 millimeters. I have some that have 4. You just kind of got to think, how far apart do I want my lines of stitching to be? The cool thing about twin needles is that when you're setting up your sewing machine, you can use 2 different spools of thread. They can be different colors, but they should be the same heaviness or thickness, so the same type of thread in your needles. And then use just your regular bobbin. And the bobbin thread actually will make a zigzag across between the 2 needle threads. And so on the top you'll have 2 rows of perfectly spaced stitching, and on the bottom you'll have something that looks a little bit like a zigzag. You've often got to play with your tension a little bit so that it's not pulling the 2 lines of fabric together, which can create something that looks like tunneling. You can stop that by just adjusting the needle thread tension on your sewing machine, and just play around with it and see what works. So yeah, that's kind of an overview of sewing machine needles. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned some useful things from it. Please consider subscribing to my channel so you can get notifications when I post new videos. And as always, I love to see likes, and I love it if you'd share my video content on your social media channels, because I am trying to build my audience, and that is one terrific way of doing it. So thanks very much, everybody. I hope you learned a lot, and have a great day.